His anti-government views helped inspire a deadly shooting at one of the nation's largest airports. But my next guest says Paul Ciancia, a white man from New Jersey, accused in the LAX shooting, should not be dismissed as someone suffering from stress or mental issues, that the issue is actually much deeper. Arsalan Iftikhar is the founder of the MuslimGuide.com and senior editor for Islamic Monthly. And his latest piece for the publication is titled, "The LAX Airport Shooter is a Terrorist." He writes in part, quote, "These same right-wingers who always call for the racial profiling of Arabs and Muslims after every terrorist attack will now be silenced, since they would now have to call for the racial profiling of every 20-something white dude from New Jersey. This would pretty much mean that the entire cast of the Jersey Shore would now be under NSA surveillance," end quote. Morning, Arsalan.
Good morning, Carol. Good to talk to you.
Glad you're here. So Ciancia is charged with serious crimes. He could get the death penalty if he's convicted. Isn't that enough?
Well, I think, what we have to look at, Carol, is the fact that, if it was a 23-year-old brown dude with a name like Muhammad Ali or Aziz Ansari, that our entire media meta-narrative would be calling this an act of terrorism, which it would be. Here you had a man who walked into a public place, Los Angeles International Airport, with an assault rifle, trying to instill fear in the general public with a political ideology, an anti-government ideology. And all that I'm saying is that if it was a brown dude with an anti-government ideology, our entire American society would be calling it an act of terrorism, which it is. And I think that Paul Anthony Ciancia should be called a terrorist.
Well, we were interested in how the FBI defines domestic terrorism, and so we looked it up. And this is how it defines domestic terrorism. 1, it involves acts dangerous to human life that violate federal or state law. 2, appear intended to, among other things, intimidate or coerce a civilian population. And 3, occur primarily within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. And all of these things certainly seem to fit what Paul Ciancia is accused of, right? But isn't there a difference between someone having mental illness and using something as an excuse, as opposed to someone who, goes to another country and is trained by terrorists overseas and then comes back into the United States to commit an act of terrorism?
Well, no, Carol. I think it's important to keep in mind that, FBI and law enforcement officials said that he carried a one-page manifesto with him, which basically was an anti-government diatribe, especially against the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration, that had disparaging comments about former DHS Secretary Janet Napolitano. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the rhetoric that he used in this manifesto was almost part and parcel of the so-called quote-unquote patriot movement here in the United States, which sees the Department of Homeland Security as an enemy in part of this, conspiracy theory, New World Order thing. And so I think under any normative definition of the term terrorism, which most people deem to be violence committed against the general public with a political ideology, and I think the patriot movement is definitely one that would fit the profile here.
Well, help us understand, in a wider perspective, how not naming Paul Ciancia a terrorist affects the Muslim community.
Well, I think it not only affects the Muslim community here in the United States, I think it affects all minorities. I think what we've done here in America, sadly, is co-opted the term terrorism to only apply to black and brown people here in the United States. And when a white man like Paul Ciancia commits that same act of terrorism, we don't see that term terrorist attached to someone like him. And so I think it sends a very, very, resounding message to people of color here in the United States that there is a terrorism double standard out there, and that if a brown man commits an act of terrorism, it will be called terrorism. But when a white man does it, then it's just mental health issues. He's just a crazy, kooky loner.
Arsalan Iftikhar, senior editor of Islamic Monthly, thanks so much for joining me this morning.
Anytime, Carol. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, we're back in a minute.